Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, Chimamanda.
Thank you.
We just introduced you as an author. I noticed in an interview when you were asked what you do, you said, I think of myself as a storyteller, but I would not mind at all if someone were to think of me as a feminist writer, and we're going to get to that. I'm going to ask you about that. Can I see a show of hands who has read any of her works, including her most recent novel, Americanah? Wow. A lot of us. If you haven't, you should. It's a love story, and it's centered on race and identity and hair, and we will get to some of those things too, but I want to start with one of the other themes that runs through it, which is the theme of movement, of immigration, of moving between different worlds. It explores the immigrant experience through Nigerian eyes. For those who haven't read it, would you give us just a quick snapshot of your protagonist and how she sees America?
Oh, that's always hard to do. Her name is Ifemelu. She leaves Nigeria to come to the US to go to college, and she goes through many experiences. It's very hard to summarize. I think one of the things I wanted to do with Americanah was to write about leaving home, write about immigration, but not in the way that I think is familiar in general for the continent of Africa. I think immigrants from Africa are often thought about as people fleeing all kinds of peril, war, poverty, but that's not the immigration that I'm familiar with. I'm familiar with the kind of immigration that is really about people seeking more choices. So they're not starving, they're welfare, they have jobs, but they want more. And I think that's what has propelled a lot of the immigration in our history as human beings. And I sometimes feel that Africa as a continent isn't really allowed that. So Ifemelu isn't dying, there isn't a war, but she wants more. There's kind of that longing for sort of wanting to escape the familiar. And she comes to the US, and one of the things that she discovers is identity. She discovers that she's black. She hasn't thought of herself as black in Nigeria because she hasn't had any need to. Because most people in Nigeria
it's majority black,
are black.
So everybody there is.
So identity in Nigeria, which is also quite fraught, is sort of religion, it's ethnicity, but not race. And in the US, she discovers that she's black, and it becomes for her a kind of, I like to think of it as an awakening, but also it gives her a subject to write a very funny, acerbic blog about race in America and about what it means, and it's sort of her reflections on blackness as a non-American black.
I want people to know that you have a personal stake in some of this conversation about migrants and movement and immigration. Your parents were displaced and lived as refugees for 3 years, is that right? Would you tell us the story?
Well, my parents went through the Nigerian-Biafran War, 1967 to 1970, so they had to flee their home in southeastern Nigeria, which was in Biafra, because the Nigerian army was advancing. And so they lived in different towns as refugees for the 3 years of the war, and then at the end of the war, they were able to go back home. But their experience and just their talking about it kind of has made me, I'm going to say empathetic, but that's not it, but it's just made me care about the subject of refugees. And it's also made me question the way that we talk about refugees.
In what way?
The way that I think that it can often be dehumanizing to think of refugees as just refugees, because people are complex beings. So when I think about my parents in the 3 years that they were refugees, but that's not all they were. They were also thoughtful, educated, kind people who had dreams and hopes. And I think that sometimes in the debate about refugees, we forget that. And I think it shapes the way we think and talk about it.
What role do you see for a writer telling a story like that in terms of shaping the narrative as we understand it, but also, I introduced you as a storyteller. Stories have a tremendous power to give people dignity.
Yes. I think the role of a storyteller in subjects of this sort is to humanize, is to remind us that people are first human beings before anything else, before being immigrants, before being refugees, before they're human. And I think it's important. It's not just because we should do it to feel good about ourselves, but also it's actually quite practical. I think if we think about the humanity of these people, then it shapes the way we formulate policy, it shapes the way we solve problems, it shapes the way we understand things. If we think about people who want to come to this country, for example, just as immigrants, without knowing what are their dreams, what are their motivations, and also on the other side, what hurts their dignity, what wounds their pride. Those things matter.
I wondered as I read Americanah, to what extent the blog that your protagonist writing is somewhat channeling your own experience as someone who came to America from Nigeria and had all of these new experiences. And I wonder, do you keep writing that in your head a little bit? I mean, as you look at the current debate over race in this country, for example, what would your protagonist have to say about it?
Do you know, I think of the blog in Americanah, I wanted it to be funny. I wanted to poke fun, because I think that there are many things about race, the way that race manifests itself in this country, that is actually quite funny. So I hope that people would laugh, and I'm always happy when people say, oh, that really made me laugh. I think what's going on now just doesn't give me room for humor. I think that I'm so emotionally exhausted by the murders that I couldn't possibly, I don't think I can find any space to wrap humor around what's been happening in the past 1 year, 2 years. So I think if I had to write, I have often thought about continuing the blog, but it probably wouldn't do much with race because I'm just exhausted. Watching the last video, I just found myself crying, and yeah, I think there's something about it that makes me, it's not just that you shoot a man who's unarmed, it's that you handcuff him when he's clearly dying. There's something about it that is so unforgivably inhumane. And to think that that's happening, that his race is part of the reason. I really do think that one of the terrible things about racism in this country is there's a sense in which blackness isn't really seen as fully human in many quarters. And I think that's why these things are happening. And I think that's why a man who is dying is handcuffed. That's why a boy who is dead is left on the street for hours. There's something about it that is just, it makes me wonder what's happened to that part of us that is good.
Do you think you'll be able to find a way to write about that? It sounds like something you're struggling with, and as a writer, I imagine that's one of the ways you process is finding a way to pour that onto the page.
Yeah, many times I've wanted to and I've started, but I almost always feel that language has failed me. And so I don't know.
Another thing I want to ask you about, which is love. Those of us who have read your books know you write about love. And right before we came out on stage, I handed Chimamanda, this is my very dog-eared paperback copy, because my mother has stolen the hardback and refuses to give it back. There was a passage that I was going to point out and ask her to comment on, but I wonder if I might ask you to read to us.
Sure.
Just one little bit, and I'll set the stage by saying this is her protagonist, is a very young woman in Nigeria, meeting a man and starting to fall in love.
So before I read, I just wanted to say, I was telling Mary Louise that that's the best thing I've heard today, or maybe in the month, that her mother
stolen the book.
I think it's fantastic. So I'll just read. She rested her head against his and felt, for the first time, what she would often feel with him, a self-affection. He made her like herself. With him, she was at ease. Her skin felt as though it was her right size. She told him how she very much wanted God to exist, but feared he did not. How she worried that she should know what she wanted to do with her life, but did not even know what she wanted to study at university. It seemed so natural to talk to him about odd things. She had never done that before. The trust, so sudden and yet so complete, and the intimacy frightened her. They had known nothing of each other only hours ago, and yet there had been a knowledge shared between them in those moments before they danced. And now she could think only of all the things she yet wanted to tell him. and wanted to do with him.
Thank you. What you can't see from the audience is that page is marked up with multiple colors of ink because I've gone back and read it. And to me, the mark of a great writer is being able to cross barriers and lines. And you come from a different world than I do. You're black and I am white. You have moved through the world in so many different ways than I have. But I felt when I read that, it was your heart speaking right up off the page to me. And I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You know, I think thank you, and that means very much to me. And I think that's the hope. That's, I think, what every writer wants to do. I grew up reading I grew up reading Russian literature. I grew up reading English, American, Indian, and loving books and loving stories and connecting to human stories. And I think that in the end, they're fundamental things that we all have in common. And I think that often is what literature sort of tries to reach and grapple with. And so it, you know, it makes me happy, again, to know that your mother took the book.
Is there anything you shy away from? Writing, putting out there that you know that all of these strangers all over the world are going to read, and then make you read on a stage in front of them?
You know, not in fiction, because I think one of the wonderful things about fiction is that you're able to hide behind fiction. And I think that's why I trust fiction much more than I trust nonfiction, right? Because it's when I was thinking, I remember reading somewhere, Gator Louise said that nonfiction is sort of the Ellis Island of literature, and he resents that. I think it really is the Ellis Island of literature. But I think that because nonfiction, because you're putting yourself at the forefront of your story, and because I think that the human urge is to self-preserve, I don't always believe non-fictional narratives, because I think that we protect ourselves. I think that if I had to write non-fiction about something, I would think about protecting not just myself, but people I love. Yeah. But with fiction, even if I base characters on real people, there's a kind of radical honesty that I can have, because it's not the real people. So I feel as though emotionally, fiction is more true. And I don't think I shy away. I mean, because fiction is so fundamentally important to me. It's the way that I feel very grateful to be read, you know, to be here, and I still sometimes can't believe it. But even if I hadn't been published, I would be writing, because it's my way of trying to make sense of the world. And I think it allows me to have a certain kind of honesty. Oh. Yeah.
Well, I've been building up to my big killer last question. This is a big one.
All right, now I'm frightened.
We, at NPR, we did an exercise these last couple of years of collecting the best commencement addresses delivered across the country every year. And yours, last year from Wellesley, 2015 address, made the cut. And my favorite moment in it is you describing why you decided to start wearing makeup. And you told a story, which I will summarize briefly here, which was you were at a dinner party in Lagos. You were a very young woman at the time, 22, 23, and this man was treating you with no respect, wasn't taking you seriously. She told the whole story beautifully, and then she paused, and you looked out at the class of Wellesley and said, I share this with you not as a great insight into gender inequality, but an ode to the power of makeup. He took me seriously. So this is my last question to you is, talk to us about the transformative power of a really good lipstick.
How much time do we have?
Reset the clock, we're going in.
No, I like makeup. And I think, I can intellectualize it and say that I think it's also partly the idea that I refuse to accept that somehow feminism and femininity are mutually exclusive. Because I really, I just find, and I think that from the time I was a child, I was raised by my mother, Grace Adichie, is the most, I'm actually not good enough for my mother. She'd be like, why don't you wear bigger earrings, more lipstick? Your hair needs to, so my femininity actually isn't good enough for my mother. So you can imagine what it was like being raised by her. But I think as an adult, she's also quite lovely. I don't have mother issues. but But I think, I found myself questioning that idea, especially when I came to the US, because I think it's quite Western, that idea that if you want to be taken seriously when you're female, you cannot care about your appearance. And I found myself sort of pretending. So I stopped wearing high heels, stopped wearing makeup when I came to the US, when I would go to writers' events, even though I grew up being told that this is the way you're supposed to present yourself to the world. You're supposed to look your best, because that's the way to show respect to the people with whom you're spending time. But also, as a feminist, I find it very offensive when people say, well, you can't be too, femininity means you won't be taken seriously. And I refuse that. I insist that, women should have the choice to be as feminine as they like, as they want to be, and still be taken seriously, right? We don't have to dress in men's oversized suits to be taken seriously. And my suggestion, perhaps, is that men should try wearing high heels to be taken seriously. I mean, I think it would be a good idea because, high heels help you with your posture.
Chimamanda, I could talk to you all afternoon, but I actually don't think we'll be able to top that as words of advice to send us out into the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you.